Welcome Little Stranger presents The Most Wonderful Wonder.
Jump in for a joyride down history's back roads, past bizarre spectacles of tragedy, folklore, and strange true tales. Join your hosts, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, as we connect weird and wonderful pieces of the past and dig up the roots of American music. This is The Flood, Part 1. Of all the natural disasters that can befall a person's home, there's a sickening pervasiveness to the destruction brought by flooding that is unmatched by any other force of nature. Unlike fire or the obliterating winds of a tornado, your home, your haven, is usually left standing. But inside the walls of your house, water, like a thief, has stolen your sense of security and your memories. But the floodwaters have left something too. Mud, silt, oil and gas residue, bacteria, and the odor of dead fish that seeps into every crack of the floorboards and permeates the walls. I was 6 years old when, after days of rain, police officers with loudspeakers drove down the streets of our neighborhood warning that the waters were rising and the Corps of Engineers would soon be opening the floodgates. We were told that if we didn't heed this warning to leave, the powers that be would not be held responsible for our safety. My single mother began stuffing our belongings into trash bags and carrying them to the attic. Despite her efforts, we still lost nearly everything. Slowly the waters receded, but we soon learned that 7 feet of stinking floodwater meant that every wall had to come down. The bleach water that my mother had been using to scrub the walls and floors would not be enough to prevent the mold that would surely follow the water's contamination, and so the entire house was reduced to a maze of studs, joists, and rafters by a crew of Mennonite volunteers. I only remember seeing my mama cry once during that devastating time. During the cleanup, neighbors had removed our once beautiful, now ruined, antique dining table and chairs from the house and were beating them to pieces on the street so as to better fit them into a dumpster. She'd already been through so much, divorced with a 3-year-old and a newborn, put out with no way to keep their milk cold but an ice chest, struggling to support her children alone. And now, 3 years later, watching everything she'd worked so hard to build and provide, being literally dashed to pieces in the street was almost too much to bear. But she bore that and more. You survive, but you never forget. For more than 20 years, the evidence could still be seen in the dark, stained lines near the eaves of the houses in our working-class neighborhood. A reminder that any sense of security we'd rebuilt was subject to the whims of nature, the specter of that muddy, stinking water ever present.
In late January of 1957, heavy rains began to fall in the Appalachians. For 7 days, the rains poured down, flooding southeastern Kentucky and parts of West Virginia, and Tennessee. The headwaters of the Big Sandy, the Kentucky, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee River Basin rose and roiled, with some areas reporting a total of 12.5 inches of rain that week. Kentucky, with its narrow, deep valleys, was hit the hardest. The floodwaters rose so rapidly that residents had to run from their homes without their belongings, lest they be swept up in the destructive waters. Communications were quickly disrupted in the area, making flood warnings an impossibility. 9 died in Kentucky. 597 homes were destroyed, and 30 different highways were blocked by high water and rock slides. Food and other necessities were readily available, but the flooding and damage to highways made it nearly impossible to deliver the supplies to the people. The Army assigned 14 helicopters to transport food, medical supplies, and clothing. The National Guard was called to duty to provide security and aid in the relief effort, as President Eisenhower declared the entire flooded region a disaster area. Coal mines in 4 counties were forced to close, and scores of footbridges, suspended from cables and used to provide access to highways from houses on the other side of streams, were destroyed. As the floodwaters rose a full 10 feet higher than the previous record, food was contaminated and drinking water became polluted. The worst hit town in the Kentucky Basin was the isolated mountain community of Hazard, where all highways were blocked by the flood and all utilities were out of operation. The streets of the town were engulfed with as much as 17 feet of water. 5 people lost their lives in the Hazard area, including one elderly couple who died when fire destroyed a house where they had taken shelter. The Birmingham News on Thursday the 31st told us some amount of dark humor in a town described by the reporter, Bill Waugh, as a city of slime, death, and grimness. One shopkeeper whose shop was destroyed laughed and pointed to a theater marquee that read, "Away all boats," as another added, "Wish we had them boats all back." The disaster, while catastrophic, was not without tales of heroism. One elderly couple had refused to leave their imperiled home, but an unidentified man carried them to safety. Another man, Mac Hill, a local coal miner, went to the aid of 2 stranded women. Hill's boat capsized and he was swept to his death. The women clung to debris and were eventually picked up by another boat. When the power failed in Hazard, the hospital had only enough emergency generators to provide light for the operating and delivery rooms and heat in the nursery. The rest of the hospital was without heat. Nurses were forced to feed 94 patients with what could be cooked on a 3-burner kerosene stove. Patients heated coffee with a blowtorch. Most harrowing is the account of the birth of William and Virginia Luttrell's child. Mrs. Luttrell was being prepared for a cesarean when an emergency generator failed and the lights in the operating room went off. The operation was performed in 5 minutes under battery-operated lights, and she was then carried to her room with her newly born son because the elevators were without power. Johnny Joe Johnson of Greasy Creek, Kentucky, recalled, "I was 34 years old when the big flood of 1957 hit. The preacher had told us the Sunday before that the end of the world was coming soon, but I didn't pay no mind to that because he said that every Sunday. But when the water started to rise and the rain didn't let up, I began to think he might be right this time. The first sign that told me we were in big trouble was when the chicken coop washed away and all the chickens that were trapped inside drowned, which is a bad way to die even for a chicken. I thought about building a raft and floating down the creek to Hyden to find help, but when I saw Mac Turner float by on a raft bouncing off rocks and trees out of control, I decided not to do it because I can't swim. I lived on Greasy Creek near Chapel, and while the water was rising, my family and I sat on my porch watching trees and buildings float by. We were having a pretty good time trying to guess whose outhouse was floating by because there was a bunch of them in the water, and I had been inside most of them. But pretty soon the water got up to the house, so I took my wife and 7 young'uns up the hill to our little coal mine where we dug out our fuel for heat. The entrance to the mine was just like a waterfall door from the rain pouring off the side of the mountain, but when we got past that, it was dry inside and we built a little fire for light and heat. I still wasn't convinced the end of the world was coming, but my wife at the time said she knew it was the end of time and she baptized all the young'uns, kicking and screaming in our waterfall door, even though they were baptized when they were born. She said they were so mean she wanted to make sure they were saved. They were pretty mean, she was right about that. She tried to do me that way too, but I told her if God didn't want me the way I was, a little water wouldn't fix nothing. When the rain let up, I went back down to the house and found that another house had washed up and lodged right beside my house. The new house belonged to Elmer Coots, but when he saw it a couple days later, he said I could keep it because he couldn't figure out how to get it back up the creek to his property. He did take the stove and bed out of the house, though. So I cut a door in both houses, built a little room connecting both houses, and when we got everything cleaned up, it was actually a blessing in disguise because we doubled the size of our house. We decided to have a few more young'uns after that because we had more space for them. But I regret that my favorite dog, Isabel, washed away. She was the best friend I ever had. I hope she made it to high ground and some kind person took her in. During that winter of 1957, Dickinson County, Virginia was also hard hit, and it was there, while stranded by floodwaters in the town of Haysai, not far from their home, where 2 brothers bore witness as the water destroyed the lives of their friends and neighbors. One of those brothers, inspired by the tragedy, immediately sat down and wrote a song he titled The Flood. A quick recording session at radio station WCYB in Bristol, Tennessee was hastily arranged, and on February 14th, Valentine's Day, just 2 weeks after the devastation began, the Stanley brothers' recording of The Flood, Carter Stanley's original song, was released like a rough and raw Valentine to the victims.
Come listen, good people, wherever you are, and hear the sad story you've been waiting for, about the flood of 57 as it happened to be in Kentucky, Old Virginia, and East Tennessee.
The flood of 57 was an act of God. But in 1919, another flood was brought about by the impatience of man. On January 15th, in Boston, Massachusetts, the sun quickly warmed the air from the single-digit temperatures of the previous day to a relatively pleasant 40 degrees. At the Purity Distilling Company, a 50-foot-tall molasses tank was filled and awaiting transfer to a nearby plant. Molasses, besides its use as a sweetener, can also be fermented to produce rum and ethanol. The primary use of this particular molasses had been for ethanol to be used in munitions, but with the Great War ending and demand for munitions-grade ethanol quickly declining, the Purity Distilling Company might have been attempting to get ahead of the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which prohibited the sale and production of alcoholic beverages. It is speculated that because of the impending ban on alcohol, the distilling company was working 3 shifts a day, and the tank, which had been built and used improperly, with basic safety tests neglected, was filled to its fullest capacity, nearly 2.3 million gallons. Arthur Gell, who oversaw the construction of the tank, had failed to fill it with water to check for defects, so that when the tank was first filled, it leaked so badly that its exterior was painted brown to hide the extent of the leakage. Neighborhood children would collect leaked molasses from the tank in cans. Years later, it was discovered through the research of a structural and metallurgical engineer that the walls were at least half as thick as they should have been, even by the lax safety standards of the day. We now know that the type of steel, the same steel that was used to build the Titanic a decade earlier, was brittle and prone to cracking. At 12:30 in the afternoon, as children played and laborers in the North End paving yard took their lunch break in a shack near the tank, the ground shook, and a deep, growling rumble echoed from Keeney Square as the massive tank began to collapse. With a deafening thunderclap, the structure exploded, filling the air with percussive pops reminiscent of a machine gun, as the rivets that held together its seams began to shoot from the tank. A wave of molasses was unleashed, 25 feet high, moving at 35 miles an hour. Within seconds, 2 city blocks were submerged in what a journalist later described as a wet, brown hell. The wave damaged the girders of the Boston Elevated Railway, and for a brief moment, tipped a railroad car off the tracks. Nearby buildings were swept off of their foundations and demolished, and people who had been standing in the area were hurled several feet by the initial gust of air. Debris from the tank, huge sheets of steel, slammed into buildings, cars, animals, and everything else in the wave's path. A section of the tank wall fell on a firehouse, crushing 3 firemen, while a truck was picked up and hurled into the harbor. The Boston Post reported, "Molasses waist-deep covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise." Docked at a nearby pier, 116 cadets from the USS Nantucket ran several blocks toward the accident, where they worked to keep curious Bostonians out of the way as rescuers struggled through the knee-deep mess to reach survivors. The Boston Police, Army, and additional Navy personnel arrived to assist. Red Cross nurses, called to duty by the tragedy, drove straight into molasses to reach the injured. The rescuers worked through the night, in spite of the difficulty of making their way through the syrup to the survivors. The search for victims lasted 4 days. The bodies of the dead so battered and thickly coated in molasses that they were nearly unrecognizable. When it was over, 21 people, including 2 10-year-old children, were dead, and another 150 were injured. The task of cleaning up the streets of Boston's North End was an immense one. The area was hosed with salt water from fireboats, staining the harbor brown for months afterward. And then the streets were covered with sand. Despite these efforts, the brown, gooey mess would not be contained. It clung to the boots, clothing, and hands of the rescuers, cleanup crews, and sightseers, traveling all over Greater Boston and even into the suburbs. The streetcars, door handles, and public telephones of Boston were glazed with the sticky residue for weeks. Locals say that the sweet smell of molasses permeated the city for decades, a fragrant and inescapable reminder of the terrible flood.
That remarkable day in Boston was not the first time molasses had left a dark and tragic mark on American history. In the hot, humid places where sugarcane flourishes, there comes a time, usually in fall or early winter, when the skies over the cane fields are choked with the billowing white smoke and the hot ash rains down in a brief but violent inferno. After a wait of a year or longer for the tropical grass to mature, the crop is set ablaze before harvest to burn the leaves and thick waxy coating from the cane stalks and to drive the venomous snakes out of the fields. After the flames die, the back-breaking work of harvesting the cane by hand begins with stooped backs and razor-sharp machetes. The work is hard, and the labor needs to be cheap, free if you can manage it. And beginning in the 1600s and early 1700s, many American colonists did manage it, with a vicious and profitable triangle of trade. Caribbean molasses, produced by juicing the sugar cane and then boiling the juice down to a thick, dark, bittersweet syrup, was carried to New England, where the colonists distilled it into rum. Some of this rum was sold domestically, but much of it was transported to Africa, where it was traded for slaves. Chained like animals, the slaves were packed into the cramped holds of wooden ships and conveyed across the Atlantic, often in such tight spaces that they weren't able to change the position of their bodies during the entire weeks-long voyage. Those who survived the starvation, dehydration, filth, dysentery, scurvy, and the worst that human suffering has to offer were sold into bondage in the Caribbean sugar plantations or the American colonies. The profits from the sale of these human beings were then used to buy more molasses, beginning the cruel cycle again. But long after slavery was abolished, human bondage continued across much of the South. In East Texas, black men were arrested and imprisoned on trumped-up or non-existent charges and put to work on state-owned sugar plantations on the banks of the Brazos River. The river, the longest in Texas, was named by the Spanish. They called it Rio de los Brazos de Dios, River of the Arms of God. This river with the heavenly name has seen the worst of human cruelty on its 840-mile journey from North Texas southeast to the Gulf of Mexico. The first sugar cane was sown in the lower Brazos River basin in the early part of the 19th century when Texas was still a part of Mexico. By 1850, 5 years after Texas joined the United States, there were 45 plantations in Brazoria County and millions of pounds of sugar under production. But the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, threatened to ruin Texas's sugarcane industry. So during the early days of Reconstruction, Texas legislators, like their counterparts elsewhere in the Deep South, introduced laws designed to incarcerate freedmen and their early descendants, known as the Black Codes. This incarceration was accomplished mainly through vagrancy laws, but any number of minor offenses could land a black man in prison. Once there, prisoners were leased to large agricultural corporations, which put them to work in the cane fields. The inhumanity and brutality experienced in these work camps made hell seem like a better alternative. Inmates were frequently beaten unconscious or worked to death, shot in the back when they could work no more. When inmates died from overwork, heat stroke, malnutrition, or a state-sanctioned bullet, the local sheriff supplied more. This profitable convict leasing continued through the early 20th century, but beginning in the 1880s, the Lone Star State began to cut out the middleman and purchase its own farmland along the river. By the summer of 1933, these state-owned prison farms were a fixture of East Texas, and it was that central unit on the Brazos where James Ironhead Baker, Ernest Williams, and an anonymous chorus of their fellow convicts sang "Ain't No More Cane" into John Lomax's state-of-the-art 315-pound phonograph uncoated aluminum disc recorder, a take that would become the headwater of an American folk classic, a song that has traveled to the present day with more twists and muddy tributaries than the mighty Brazos.
Ain't no more cane on the Brazos. They grind it all up in molasses. Captain, don't you do me like you done poor Shine. You drive that bully till he went stone blind. You ought to been on the river 1904. You find many a dead man almost every row. You ought to been on the river 1910. Well, they drive the women like they drive the men. Rise up, old Lazarus, hold up your head. Well, you may get your pardon now, but you may drop dead. There's some in the building and there's some on the farm. There's some in the graveyard and there's some going home.
The Most Wonderful Wonder is researched, written, scored, and produced by Mr. and Mrs. Hall of Welcome Little Stranger. To learn more about the show, visit themostwonderfulwonder.com, and while you're there, subscribe to our newsletter for each episode's source notes, wondrous surprises, and the most up-to-date news about the podcast and Welcome Little Stranger. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for part 2 of The Flood.